All right, in chapter 4, you're going to be reading about victims' rights and services and a lot of the laws that have been passed for victims' rights. First of all, let's look at the types of victimization. Primary victimization is the person that is actually affected or personalized victim. So the person who is targeted. Secondary can be family, friends, but it can also be things as commercial establishments, schools, churches, anything in the community, or other people that are affected by that primary victimization. And then tertiary victimization really just goes out to the community at large. When you think about 9/11, for example, we had people that were, of course, personally victimized. We had families and friends who were victimized. We had commercial establishments that were destroyed. And then we also had the community at large, New York City, all of the communities that were directly affected, but it even went out to all of us in terms of how we travel, how we go through airport security, our understanding about terrorism. All right, when it comes to victims' right legislation, the crime victim movement here in the United States really began in the 1970s, and it went out globally as well in terms of becoming important. We had the first international symposium on victimology that was held in Jerusalem in 1973, and so that was kind of a big thing, a big first international conference, if you will, about victimology. In 1985, we had the United Nations Declaration about basic principles of justice for the victims of crime and abuse of power, which identify the needs for state action, and that included, and these are listed in table 4.1 on page 108 of your textbook. So access to justice and fair treatment, restitution, compensation, and assistance. So addressing the fact that victims have a right to all of those things. In Canada, in 1986, they passed the Justice for Victims of Crime Act, and then that was later changed with the addition of the Victims' Bill of Rights, which focused on crime control. So both of those for Canada not only focused on the victims' rights with the 1986 Act, but also in terms of the criminal justice system, which included the right to be informed of the final disposition of the case, to be notified of any court proceeding, to receive protection, to be informed on receiving witness fees, to be provided with secure waiting area when practical, and this is for witnesses or victims. And then in 2004, we had the United States enacted the Crime Victims' Rights Act. And this really was kind of the first, well, actually, we had more that was passed before that. In 1982, we had the Presidential Task Force on Victims' Rights, and out of that task force came the passage of the Federal Victim and Witness Protection Act, and that was also passed in 1982. We had the Victims of Crime Act, which was passed in 1984. So all of those things that were passed in the 1980s were directly related to victims, addressing the right to victim services, victim compensation, victim witness assistance, domestic violence programs, sexual assault prevention programs. All of these legislative acts that were passed were directly related to victims. The Crime Victims' Rights Act, which was passed in 2004, gives victims the following rights: to be reasonably protected from the accused, to reasonable, accurate, and timely notice of proceedings, to not be excluded from any such public proceedings, to be reasonably heard, to confer with an attorney for the government in the case, to fully and timely restitution as provided by the law, and to be free from unreasonable delay. So addressed both rights in terms of restitution, but also with regard to the criminal proceedings. All right, the victim's right to compensation. So this is addressing the victim's right to be compensated for any losses that they may receive from being victimized. So that can include monetary funds for injuries, for the need for psychological treatment, for loss of wages. Became internationally an issue in the 1960s with New Zealand passing the first law, England the same year. Nationally in the United States, victims' compensation is being handled in one of four ways. It's a component of victim witness programs, and victim witness programs are often either state or federal programs. They can also be nonprofit organizations as well, through victim offender reconciliation in conjunction with parole or probation services, or through court-based employment programs where all of the money that would be given back to victims would come from the actual offender and not from taxpayers. Now, when you think about how much money victims get, it really kind of depends on the state. Anywhere from, some states have a maximum of $25,000. And, other states have no cap on it. The Crime Victims Fund in the United States was established through the VOCA in 1984, and this is how funds are distributed to victims. They're collected through criminal fines, forfeiture of bail bonds, penalties, special assessments, and then the victims can then apply to have these funds cover, again, crime-related medical costs, funeral costs, mental health counseling, lost wages, anything that goes beyond insurance programs. And again, it kind of depends on the state in terms of how much money the victims can actually apply for. In Canada, in 1969, Alberta developed the first legislation that led to the development of a victim compensation program. We've had them in other parts of the world as well. Canadians actually reversed those laws, discontinued transfer payments, and made it a little bit more difficult for victims to get money. Awards made under victim compensation programs are generally perceived to be quite low. They don't generally cover all of the loss that victims may have. U.S. compensation programs spent a record combined total of $499 million in state and federal funds in federal fiscal year 2010. So really the cost of victimization is really well beyond that. That just includes things that have actually been paid out. Victim rights and the courts. One of the biggest changes that we've seen is the right for victim impact statements. This is giving the victim the opportunity to have their voices heard at the sentencing stage of the trial process. This really kind of started in the mid-1970s, and by the end of the 1990s, 49 states allowed victim impact statements. Now, victim impact statements can be read by attorneys. It kind of depends on the state and the court. They can be read by attorneys, family members, the actual victim. The Victim Information and Notification Everyday Program allows victims of domestic violence 24-hour access via phone, internet, or email to reliable information about the criminal cases and custody status of the offenders, letting them know if somebody has escaped from jail, what's going on with their case, are they going to be going up to parole. Just gives the victim the right to know what is going on with the offender. It is available now in over 2,100 communities across the United States, which is really helpful for victims to kind of know ahead of time that a person is going to be released or that they're going up for parole, things like that. All right, services for victims. Victim services has risen quite a bit over the past 40 years. the National Organization for Victims Assistance, NOVA, was established in 1975 as a national umbrella organization dedicated to expanding current victim services. And then in 1998, through an amendment to the 1984 VOCA Act, the Federal Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, was formally established. Both of these organizations, I'm going to show you these, both of these organizations offer crisis response, advocacy, help information. They also offer training for people that are going to be working with victims. So this is the NOVA website. And then we also have the Office for Victims of Crime. Same thing here. They offer help for crime victims. They have grants and fundings. They have news features, library so that you can educate yourself, victims' rights, information about all of the victim right laws. And they also have training as well. Both of these are really great in terms of anybody that wants to work with victims in getting training. Both of those are really good organizations for that. So you take a look at those websites and you'll get an idea of what they are about and the services that they offer. Now, the women's movement specifically related to victims of sexual assault in the early 1970s, when police departments and rape crisis centers first began to address the crime of sexual assault. Little was known about victims, offenders. A lot of victims felt like they were being victimized twice. First, they had the initial sexual assault, and then they had to go through these horrific interviews with police officers. They had to go through very invasive examinations in the hospital in order to document the victimization, gather evidence. Traditionally, they were seen by male doctors who really had kind of very little empathy or understanding of what victims were going through. So they had a program called the SANE program and Sexual Assault Response Team, SARTs. So this was a training program that began in the 1970s in Tennessee, where they specifically trained nurses in how to have empathy for victims, what victims are going through, and how to make that initial examination in the hospital as little in terms of being horrific as possible. It's going to be difficult for a victim in any case, but we're trying to do as little harm. So these forensic nurses practice, focus on collecting evidence from patients and understand the trauma that these victims have really gone through. So these programs have been really helpful in aiding patients going through this. There are also a lot of, depending on the state and community that you live in, there's a lot of rape crisis programs in different states that offer or that have volunteers who will meet rape victims at hospitals. And these volunteers have been specially trained about what victims are going to have to go through. And they're there to kind of walk victims through the examination process. They sit with them the whole time. They explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. So it's really helping victims to get through, this really difficult examination that has to be done. In addition to that, they have also started training police officers in a lot of states on how to deal with victims of sexual assault in a more compassionate way, because police officers are usually the first interaction that a victim is going to have with the criminal justice system. So it's really important that police officers be trained so that they can have a little bit of empathy for the victims, an understanding of what victims have gone through, and that can really help the victims in terms of not feeling victimized a second time by the criminal justice system. We've also had a host of domestic violence and intimate partner violence services that have been created for victims of any type of domestic violence. And domestic violence and intimate partner violence are both pretty much the same thing. Intimate partner violence is a term that most people use more today than domestic violence, because domestic violence kind of technically was related to people who are married or living together. When we expand that term out to intimate partner violence, it includes anybody that has been in any type of intimate relationship with somebody. You don't have to be married, you don't have to be living together, you don't have to be heterosexual. So it's a more inclusive term. So a lot of these programs have emerged in the 1970s, and by 1989, almost all 50 states had provisions for funding of services and intervention programs. Today, we have over 1,200 shelters in operation throughout the United States and Canada. These shelters offer, of course, a safe haven from domestic violence. These shelters often offer other services as well, like counseling services for victims. They offer education programs, funding programs for women to become educated in a new career path so that they can leave abusive relationships. Comprehensive continuum of services for the criminal justice system. We have a lot of different programs that were created specifically in the criminal justice system to help victims of domestic violence or interpersonal violence. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence was passed in 1978. The National Network to End Domestic Violence was passed in 1990. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence established an alliance of state coalitions and emergency shelters that consist of a representative from each state. This particular organization has 50 statewide domestic violence coalition programs that lobby and advocate for improved social services and legal rights for battered women and their children. The National Network to End Domestic Violence, again established in 1990, is another member and advocacy organization that's similar to the NCADV, and it helps to build and strengthen the responsiveness of federal public policies and concerns with vulnerable battered women and their children. These programs have raised $20 million to almost $90 million, depending on the year, between 1995 and 2000, again, to increase services available to women and their children. We also have victims and services for victims and witness programs. These are typically, not always, but typically run out of public defenders' offices or district attorneys' offices. They usually have, depending on how big the state is, a district attorney's office will have people that work in their office that are dedicated just for either witness assistance or to provide services for victims. They can also be through the courthouse. They can also be through nonprofit agencies, but the vast majority of them are with local prosecutor's office, local district attorneys. These programs were designed to encourage witness cooperation by explaining the entire legal process. The legal process can be very intimidating. It can take a very long time. It can be very frustrating. It can be very scary. So these victims' assistants will explain the legal process to victims of crime or witnesses, help them understand what will be going on if they are testifying in court, kind of do witness prep, kind of tell them what kind of questions might be asked. They might go with them if they are doing any type of lineup or looking through photo lineups with police departments. So it's really just about kind of helping people get through the entire criminal justice process from the time somebody is victimized to when the case is completed. It is a long process. It's a scary process, and most people don't really understand the criminal justice system or what's involved with the trial process or being a witness. So these victims advocates or victims assistants really help people get through that. Now, when it comes to evaluating victim assistance programs, the Office of Victims of Crime, the OVC, which I showed you their website a few minutes ago, funded Vision 21. This was a project whose objectives were to examine the existing framework of the victims assistant field nationwide and explore new and existing challenges facing the field. So just kind of reevaluating what was going on and how we could transform the system. So the goal of transforming the system to make victims assistance programs more effective. After they did this report and looked at all of the programs in the United States, they found that there is challenges in integrating research into victim services, availability of legal assistance, problems with the impact of advances in technology, globalization, and changing demographics, especially here in the United States, and the capacity for serving victims and the infrastructure issues and financial issues, I will add as well. There's often not enough money to fund programs that have enough victims assistance or victims advocate to make sure that every victim is getting the help, treatment, and assistance that they need. Now, when it comes to the psychological response to victimization, everybody is different. So different temperaments predispose people to deal differently with trauma. The psychological response will also depend on the type of crime, the relationship between the victim and the offender, the type of physical injuries, and then, of course, everybody's individual coping skills will impact how they respond to a particular crime. So you can't assume that all victims of sexual assault are going to go through the exact same psychological responses. You can't assume that all victims of aggravated assault are going to be affected the exact same way. So you really do, as anybody that's going to be working with victims, understand that everybody's going to react very differently. One of the things that we find happens most often with victims of crime is they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. You probably heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is an anxiety disorder that people can develop after they have been exposed to a situation in which they felt as if their life or their personal safety was at risk. So one of the, and again, this is an anxiety disorder. It does affect women more than men. And historically, we have associated it with being in a combat situation, which is very true, but it can also be from being in any natural disaster, being in a car accident, or being the victim of a crime. So it is direct exposure to a situation, witnessing something in person, learning about it, or just exposure to anything that makes you feel like your own personal safety has been affected. But we also see it in like first responders when they're collecting body parts, or they're going to a car accident and seeing some of the things, or a fire. So there are a lot of different situations. Some of the symptoms that go along are intrusion of memories, flashbacks that you can't control of the situation or the incident, avoidance, and that means kind of avoiding anything that will trigger it. People will drive out of their way to avoid a place where they had a car accident or where a crime took place. Negative altercations in cognitions and mood. So kind of negative thinking patterns, really these intrusion of flashbacks and memories and thoughts can, take you back to the victimization and really affect your mood. We find that there are traumatic nightmares, dissociative reactions, that's those flashbacks. Anything that reminds you of it will cause you to react differently. Again, the stressor is whatever you were exposed to. We have those intrusive symptoms. The flashbacks are really difficult for people to get away with, avoidance patterns of behaviors. And by the way, post-traumatic stress disorder is very difficult to treat. People can suffer from the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder for years because it is so difficult to treat. People also have an exaggerated startle response, trouble sleeping, eating, trouble maintaining a job and personal relationships. So PTSD can really affect every aspect of functioning. There are some medications, by the way, that can help with some of the symptoms associated with PTSD. Anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants can be really helpful. Trauma in the limbic system. We do have a system in our body that is activated when we are exposed to a stressor. So it's called the alarm system. We have when this system is activated, it causes stress hormones to be released. It activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for a fight or flight response, which is an automatic response, which we really don't have a lot of control over. Because all of these systems are linked, the limbic system, the automatic nervous system, the excessive hormones, when we have, if something like PTSD and you have these flashbacks, it can cause all of these alarm systems to be activated again. So it can cause kind of this pattern, if you will, that will just keep activating and activating and activating, causing people stress over and over and over. And by the way, long-term stress, long-term activation of the sympathetic nervous system is really not good for us. It negatively impacts our immune system, making it so that it's easier for us to get sick, and it can take longer to get better if we do get exposed to something that makes us sick. So it's really unhealthy for us. Protocols for PTSD, and this would be psychologists or psychiatrists that would be dealing with somebody that has post-traumatic stress disorder, somebody in a clinical setting. They need to assess the victim's trauma, make the diagnosis, and then, of course, devise a treatment plan. The National Center for PTSD has a list of assessment tools that can be downloaded. Table 4.4 has a list of some of these different tools that can be used by clinicians. And again, we're talking about psychiatrists, clinical psychologists or psychiatrists. And it's just tools that you can use along with clinical meetings. So meeting with a patient in person, maybe a couple of times, and then giving them, one or more of these assessments will allow somebody to effectively and correctly diagnose somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, trauma is not limited to just PTSD. People can develop depression, other anxiety disorders, issues with drug and alcohol. It can impede people's ability to have effective and healthy interpersonal relationships. So it's not just PTSD that we worry about. There are a lot of other psychological problems that can develop as well. Now, there's a model that was developed by Roberts in 2015, which is a 7-stage crisis intervention model, and it provides a structured and targeted framework for psychologists or psychiatrists who are going to be working with victims of crime. It helps them to create a comprehensive long-term service plan. Now, this could also be used by crime victim advocates when they're going to be referring victims of crime out to psychologists and psychiatrists as well. So number one, assessing a person's safety is the first is the first thing that a psychiatrist, psychologist, or advocate would want to do. Establish rapport and communication. Remember, people have been victimized, so you really need to develop a sense of trust. Identify the major problems that the victim is experiencing, and prioritize them in terms of what needs to be treated immediately. Deal with feelings that a person is having and provide support. You really have to have kind of empathy of what a person is going through. Explore possible alternatives in terms of helping to resolve the crisis. That might be medications, it might be long-term therapy, it might be addressing coping skills, formulate an action plan of the steps that can be taken to get the person back to a place where they feel healthy, and where they can move forward with their life. And then make sure that you are following up, because people can be suffering long term from victimization. So you want to make sure that you are having long-term treatment. Now, some of the different approaches in terms of therapy, and again, this would be psychologist or psychiatrist. We have cognitive behavioral therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapies are kind of the gold standard in therapy right now in psychology. The cognitive behavioral therapy addresses two things: cognitions and behaviors. Cognitions are your thinking processes, and your behaviors are any behaviors that are not adaptive. So it addresses both. So we will address in therapy your thinking patterns that are causing you problems, and then behavior responses that are causing you problems. Treatment strategies can include systematic desensitization, which is exposing to somebody to something that is causing them stress over and over again until they become desensitized to it and it doesn't cause them stress anymore. Aversion therapy, kind of the same thing. Shaping behaviors by rewarding behaviors that you want to increase. Positive and negative reinforcement, and role modeling of adaptive behaviors. And these would be helpful for anybody who has developed some kind of really maladaptive behaviors as a way to respond to the victimization or stress. Maybe somebody started drinking or using alcohol or engaging in risky behaviors. And we want, and those behaviors, they feel like it's numbing their stress, but it's actually making their stress worse. So we want to help them find more adaptive ways of dealing with the stress and anxiety that the victimization has caused, and more adaptive behaviors. Goals of positive learning and change are reinforced through cognitive restructuring, identifying dysfunctional core beliefs, role-playing, rehearsal, relaxation, stress management. These are some of the things that we want to replace any bad behaviors with. Self-monitored homework assignments, problem solving, also things like meditation, relaxation, exercise, kind of healthy ways to deal with stress instead of unhealthy ways that are going to end up causing somebody more stress and kind of keep that trauma there for a longer period of time. Psychotherapy is another form of intervention. It is an interpersonal relational intervention used by trained psychotherapists to aid victims in problems of living. There are a lot of different therapies out there. And again, they're really just designed, and by the way, psychotherapy just means talk therapy. So it's any therapy where you're going to be going into a psychologist's office, that would be a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, but most talk therapy is done by clinical psychologists. And there are a lot of different approaches. It could be the psychodynamic approach, body-centered therapy, interpersonal experiential therapies, humanistic therapies. There are a lot of different approaches, but the goal is to identify the problems and allow the victim to talk about the problems. As a therapist, you would want to ask questions, help them kind of really understand what is causing them the trauma, and then help them work through the trauma and then get back to a place where they feel like they are able to have a normal life again and to be back to a place of good. Now, that can take a while. Now, primary treatment effectively ends when the client has stabilized enough and feels as if they can now pursue their life, their work, their relationships in a healthy manner. You might also, as a psychologist, as a psychiatrist, as a victim's advocate, you might also need to refer victims out for other issues, legal issues, financial, educational assistance. And any psychologist, psychiatrist, or victim's advocate, or social worker, anybody that's going to be working directly with victims of crime needs to make sure that there is a regular follow-up schedule. Because people do relapse. People do, they have anniversaries of that remind them of things. They're going to have situations that remind them and trigger them. There are a lot of triggers that people will continue to have, even if they have kind of stabilized and are able now to kind of, pursue their work, pursue their relationships. They feel better. But they're going to be triggers. That's why regular follow-up contact should be part of any treatment plan of anybody that's going to be working with patients. So a lot of great information in this chapter. As you read through the chapter, we'll go into things in more in depth than I did here. I was just kind of giving you an idea of what is in this chapter. If you have any questions about anything in the chapter, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.